amser a Susan. Gawn ni chwrwch lan a stretchwch os ydych chi moyn y beth bynnag trafod Susan yn dod o hyd yw Anerchiad a ti'n dod lan. Come forward, Susan. Over the road. Gawn ni gyflwyno y perchedig Dr Susan Derber i chi. Mae Susan yn weinidog ordiniedig gyda'r UAC. Mae'n byw nawr yn Sir Derber yn Hwlffordd, dwi'n meddwl. Ac yn falch o hynny hefyd. O'n i'n clywed oedd Dyfed o hynna yn Llundain yn cyfarfodydd blynyddol Cyngor Cristnogol. Susan oedd un o'r pobl oedd yn rhoi yn anerch y cyfarfod. Ac yn ymfalchio yn y ffaith bod hi'n yn byw yn Sir Benfro. Susan, I'm just saying that you are now living in Pembrokeshire and happy to live in Pembrokeshire. Both Dyfed and I remember you speaking of very warmly of the churches around you, with the way that you are aware that some people may look down on them because they are small, but you liken them to wells for honey, and that you have been to the well and you can say that there is water. Mae Susan yn Llywydd, un o'r newyddion Cyngor Eglwysi'r Byd, y Llywydd sydd yn cynrychioli adran rhanbarth Ewrop. Hi hefyd oedd yn cymedroli yr adran, y Comisiwn Ffydd a Threfn Cyngor Eglwysi'r Byd. Yn gyn Brifathro Coleg Westminster, yn ymgynghorydd diwinyddol i Cyngor Cristnogol yn 19, ac yn awdur toreithiog ar faterion ffydd a threfn. A mae rhai o'r llyfrau hi gyda astudiaethau Beiblaidd yn wych dros ben. I did say to you, Susan, that you're one of my, well actually what I said to you, that you are my favourite preacher, you may remember me saying. But in this context, I think I should take my words back. Susan, croeso, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you on Faith, Unity and Mission in Wales 2025, encouragement from Nicaea, Nicaea 325. Croeso.
Bore da. Bore da. Diolch yn fawr I croeso. I'm sorry I can't say much more than that in your mother tongue. But thank you so much for the welcome and for your invitation to speak to you. I'm English, as you see, and I've lived in Wales for only a year and a half. But I can honestly say that living here has renewed my faith. The daily walks in beautiful landscapes, the stormy beaches, the grandeur of creation, more space in my life for prayer and reflection, joining a choir, singing a whole new, to me, repertoire of song, Hant of Edwin, and Teddy Aroddaist, and that Amen at the end. Wow. I felt it in my body. Joining these small communities of faith, people with deep connections to the land and to each other, and yet also warmly welcoming and accepting. You have shown me what community can really be. And I think I now understand better the kind of rural and local culture that Jesus himself was part of. What a privilege. What might be seen as moving to the edge of the United Kingdom, the edge of Wales, has been for me a return to the centre, a renewal of faith. So I'm deeply grateful. But I also see the statistics about faith in Wales. I see the closed chapels, the small, ageing congregations. I read A.N. Wilson's recent autobiography, in which he makes a casual reference to things that he says don't exist anymore, like miners and Welsh chapels. Whoa! And I'm familiar with the statistical modelling of John Haywood, an academic from this university. And I know his projections that the United Reformed Church, my own church, will cease to exist in 2038. It's not very far off. And your own church, the Union of Welsh Independence, slightly better. You're going to last, apparently, until 2052. Now, he says these are projections, not predictions. But he models the statistics in a vital and disturbing way. Yeah. And there are many among people I know who've experienced a deep grief as their chapel, their congregation has closed, as they faced a slow but inexorable decline in numbers, the ageing or death of key church members and leaders, and the feeling of being overwhelmed by increasing compliance admin, or just the struggle to keep that roof on and the windows in place and the bills paid. And for some, COVID-19 has been a kind of last straw. And this very deeply personal experience is against the background of the slow creep of an increasingly secularised culture in Europe. The failure to stem the slow attrition of belief in God in the United Kingdom and in Europe more widely. And the reality that whole generations have simply stopped going to church. There are some church communities that are thriving, active, faithful and buoyant. And we saw that lovely, delightful Sunday school in the video before coffee. But there are many more where faithful people are tired, having tried to keep their local congregation going, and frankly can do it no longer. Today, in some places, as one writer has put it, Christianity is ageing, enfeebled, short of breath. Then there is the covenant between churches in Wales, and I was very excited about, made in 1975, how wonderful it seems and how wonderful it is on paper, but how little it seems to be taken seriously in practice. And there are frustrations that it is now almost 50 years old, and still those who entered this covenant remain as separate churches. There are murmurings about what to do next. And of course, since I belong, as I've said, to the United Reformed Church, I carry a particular disappointment about both unity and mission, particularly perhaps about unity. My church had such high hopes in 1972 of being the beginning of a wave of unity that would revive the churches and renew them for witness to our nations. But since then, there have been no major unions of the sort that were imagined, and our membership in the United Reformed Church has declined rapidly, as John Haywood points out. A URC minister I much admired, Reverend Keith Forecast, who ministered for a time in Cardiff, the generation before me, has written in his memoir, reflecting on his contemporaries in ministry. Now, Keith Forecast was one of the most buoyant, joyful, faithful ministers I've ever met. So read this in that context. We knew the church was getting smaller, but I don't think it ever occurred to us that when we came towards the end of our ministries, people might seriously be talking about the extinction of the church as we knew it. Now there are times when we seem to see the church we have loved and to which we have given our lives steadily evaporating before our eyes. And it's not just my denomination or yours. The Anglican churches and even the Roman Catholic Church are having the same experiences of decline and are suffering the same anxieties. But I'm here to speak encouragement. And I've come to a place in my own faith where I am no longer as anxious as I once was about the decline of the institution of the church, or some of its institutions. I don't expect the church to continue in the ways that many of us have grown up with, but I'm not looking for that anymore. We won't ever have hundreds of children at Sunday schools again, or chapels filled 3 times on a Sunday. We're not going to return to what we were. It's not a question now of getting people into the existing institutions of the church, and maybe there's a kind of liberation in setting that aim aside. The boundaries need to be opened up. We follow Jesus, who wants to go out to the poor and wounded of the world. So I'm looking instead for the new thing that might emerge in the future, in God's future. And I have faith that God, whose creation the church is, will work his wonderful miracle, whatever it is. And I'm looking for a way of being Christian and being the church and engaging with the world, which has a really authentic connection with Jesus and that provides a response to the needs of the world today. And I recognise that I can only testify to that if at the same time I'm searching for it and welcoming its creation within me, which I think moving to Wales has begun. So where can we look, where do I look for encouragement and inspiration for the path we're now set free to walk? Historians are useful here. I've met some very cheerful historians who will say to me things like, movements rise and fall. The church has its springs and its long, hard winters. It happens. New things will rise. And being a part of world Christianity through the WCC for me is also wonderfully helpful. My experience there has shown me how varied our faith is and how varied it can be, and how ancient, how multicultural, and how adaptable. We have plenty of stories of places where faith has flourished and faded, and where it has also been almost completely wiped out and then revived and renewed. The Orthodox Church in Albania is one such amazing example. The Resurrection Church, with a bishop, an archbishop called Anastasios. It's very different from Welsh nonconformity, but it has a story to tell us. But today I want to take you to a particular place where I have found real encouragement, and a place where I hadn't thought to look for it and would never have expected to find it. And perhaps you won't either, and some of you will have to bear with me a bit, I think. So I'm going to take you to a particular moment in the life of the early church. Now, I was never as a student, and Geraint Rees here knew me as a student at Mansfield College in Oxford. I was not much drawn to early church studies. I found it rather boring, rather male-dominated, rather obscure all those arguments about doctrine that it was hard to feel passionate about, even if you could understand them. But because of my role in the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, I found myself being asked to prepare to mark the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. Woo! Yes. 1700 years. And in doing that, I discovered again the story of a moment in our history as Christianity came into a kind of light out of a very dark time of persecution, when Christians tried to find the right ways to speak to a wider and very alien world, a Christianity that had known suffering, ridicule and persecution, a church prone to argument and division that struggled to forgive its weaker members, those who'd given in to the pressures of persecution and made sacrifices to the Roman gods, and a Christianity that wanted to know how to speak about Jesus in ways that those who were not Christians could understand. So I think there are some parallels with our time. So, just a quick summary for those of you who might have forgotten your early church history. What was Nicaea? Well, it was a council. This is a council, a bit like this one. An assembly of about 250 bishops, called by the Emperor Constantine to sort out a number of problems facing the church at the time. It produced a statement of faith to tackle a particular theological issue. It addressed all sorts of other fascinating and different problems and issues, and it made a decision about when Easter should be celebrated. It met at Nicaea in modern-day Turkey, Iznik now, over a couple of months in the summer. So a bit different. 2 days in Wales is not quite the same as 10 weeks in Turkey, but there you are. It's the first time that bishops from all over the then known world gathered together. And it met at the time when Constantine had just become the sole emperor of the Roman world, and he wanted a united religion to match his now united empire. Now, you'll find different views about Nicaea amongst Christians all around the world. I have Orthodox friends for whom Nicaea was absolutely the greatest moment in Christian history, the first ecumenical council, and every bishop there, whether we know their name or not, is made a saint. Orthodox Christians describe the Nicene Creed, which eventually emerged out of Nicaea, as a universal symbol of faith. And it's the Nicene Creed became the essential measure for membership of the World Council of Churches. So there's those of my friends. Then I have other friends who've watched the film The Da Vinci Code, yes? And they see Nicaea as the moment when the radical prophet of Nazareth, the Jesus of the Gospels, was turned into a god who required worship. I met someone this week who associates all creeds with violence, oppression, coercion, authoritarianism, imposed conformity. Think of Lloyd George at school organising his fellow pupils into a rebellion against saying the Catechism of the Church of England. Nicaea was a moment, some say, when the Church became an instrument of empire rather than forced to oppose empire, or a moment when Christianity turned into a kind of elitist philosophy that used fancy Greek words like ousia and homoousios. So, with friends on both sides of the argument, I decided to do some reading myself. I had to ask myself, well, history tends to be written by the winners, and we can't always get very close to anything like a BBC or Al Jazeera account of what happened at Nicaea. But here is what I've learned. As Rory Stewart would say, an explainer. Christianity grew quite a bit during the first centuries after Christ, but it was one of a number of religions. Sometimes Christians were persecuted and sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they got on well with the emperors, sometimes they didn't. But then came Diocletian, who wanted to go back to the old gods and to wipe out Christians. And from the year 303, there was a widespread and truly horrible persecution. Churches were torn down, property was confiscated. It was very savage, particularly in the east. Then in 312, 9 years later, Constantine famously faced his rival Maxentius, and having put the Chi-Rho symbol on his banners, the two first letters of the word Christ. So he thought, Christ wins me battles. And then in 313, the next year, Christianity became a tolerated religion within the empire. No more persecution. Then 324, Constantine, you still with me, becomes the sole emperor, and he wanted a united empire under one emperor with one religion. And so he was attracted to a faith that said, we have one God and we prize unity among our people. So he restored and rebuilt the confiscated churches. He lavished wealth on some of the bishops and the people. But then he discovered that this religion wasn't as united as he thought it was. So he decided to gather together the bishops, the leaders, and told them to sort it out. So there were different views amongst Christians about how they should treat those who'd given in to persecution. Should they forgive them, welcome them back, or should they be banned? They were celebrating Easter on different days, and there were arguments about who belonged, which bishop had which episcopal see. You can imagine now there was property to fight over. Yeah, that would put your constitutional debate into the shade. and there was a theological debate going on about how we speak about Jesus. So Constantine said, you must sort this out, I can't. He didn't sort it out himself. He got the bishops together and he chose a lovely venue, lovely climate. He paid the travel expenses of the bishops. He was there to greet them at the opening ceremony, dressed in all his finery, on a great throne, and he put on a wonderful dinner at the end of it. But he didn't preside. They met for 10 weeks with final decisions made at the end of August. About 250 of them from Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. The Bishop of Rome, much to the regret of people later, didn't come in person, but sent 2 presbyters instead. And most of these bishops came with a small entourage. So you can imagine hundreds of people gathered together in this lovely venue. It's actually, as I read accounts of it, it sounds like many WCC meetings I've been to. No one might appreciate this. The place chosen for its climate, wonderful facilities, travelling expenses paid for those who can't manage it, a greeting from the head of state who makes an inspiring speech about the importance of unity, a big dinner, a draft text brought before the gathering, a drafting committee sent off to revise it, long arguments until someone comes up with a uniting word or phrase that has many meanings, and then everyone goes home and the unity falls apart until the next meeting. That's my experience. So there are lots of accounts of Nicaea that don't agree quite, and stories of pretty violent disagreements at times. But I've been to some alarming ecumenical meetings, so I can imagine it. Many of those present, those 250 bishops, many of them had been imprisoned or tortured in the persecution that had only ended a few years earlier. There's a touching story of Constantine kissing an empty eye socket of one of the participants. It made me think of Salman Rushdie reading that. These were people who had suffered. They'd been through enormous trauma, now being welcomed by the emperor. Can you imagine how blessed they must have felt? But there were problems too. So what did they agree? Well, they agreed 20 canons, which I leave you to look up later if you want to. Things like, no one who castrates themselves can be a priest. I take it that's not a problem in the UWI. There should be no women living with priests except their mother, sister or aunt. No one should be made a bishop or presbyter immediately after their baptism. No, some theological training first. No church leaders should lend money at interest. To avoid covetousness and lust of gain. And Christians should always stand to pray on Sundays because it's the day of resurrection. So no nonconformist crowd standing for prayer. And the dispute about the date of Easter, they agreed they would always celebrate it on a Sunday. Imagine a time when that wasn't the case. And then the controversy about how we speak about Jesus. They agreed a short statement, much shorter than what we know as the Nicene Creed. Think of it as it was a theological statement to tackle a particular problem. No one imagined at Nicaea that it would become a much longer creed, or that it should be said in worship every Sunday. They'd be astonished to find it, or a longer version of it, being said solemnly in churches nearly 1700 years later. I'll just read you the little bit they wrote about Jesus Christ, because that was the crux of the argument. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father before all ages, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father, by whom all things were made. I find those beautiful words, poetry almost. But to try to get a sense of what this debate might have meant and what Nicaea might offer us today, there's someone I want you to meet. And I'm going to invite you to open up your imagination. I'll go and get her, just a minute. My name is Joanna. I was part of the delegation with my bishop at Nicaea. I didn't get a vote or anything, but he couldn't have made it without me there to wash his robes and his underlinen, and make sure he had enough to eat and got to bed in time for some sleep. My master is called Peter, and he's bishop of a small diocese in Anatolia. You couldn't find it now on a map, but it was a big deal at the time. We came to Nicaea with a priest and a couple of deacons. And you might be interested to know that I grew up in Philippi, where we had women who were episcopoi once. You can read that in the letter Paul wrote to our church. But those days are gone, and now the only role for women is either this one or being a copyist. My bishop wasn't always called Peter. That's his baptismal name. He was born a slave of a slave mother. His slave master, his enslaver, called him Tertius, which just meant he was the third slave to be trained to read and write and copy documents, just like the slave who helped Paul write his letter to the Romans. He was good at scribing, was Tertius, so good that he found an admirer and a patron, a Christian, who bought him out of slavery. He then became a Christian himself and a leader in the church where we come from, and eventually an episcopos. And so he was at Nicaea, a freed slave. He wasn't the only bishop there to be a freed slave. There were quite a lot, but we never knew whether the emperor was aware of that. There were arguments for days at Nicaea, and nights too. You know what it's like at conferences. There were drafts and redrafts, fresh starts and changes of direction. My master, Bishop Peter, was on the drafting group, so I know how tough it was. But I so admired him for doing it. These things really matter. They've been arguing about what language to borrow. What else can you do when you're trying to speak about the mystery of God, but borrow words? Language to convey what and who Jesus is. He was a human being, flesh and blood, like you and me. But he was also God, the same as God. But not in the way that they've sometimes described the emperor as God. Not as one among many gods, not just another demigod, but the closest we could ever get to seeing God's very self. One day at Nicaea, my master found a way to say this that we knew captured it best in the language that we all spoke. He is of the same being as God, homoousios. Now, of course, the drafting group were not the big hitters at Nicaea. Those people wouldn't have stayed up into the night drafting. So Bishop Peter suggested that the emperor himself might propose the new word. And he was persuaded to do it. Anything to get this over the line, he said. And of course it worked. But you might be asking why any of this mattered. Will anyone really ever thank us for this piece of ecumenical drafting? Well, this is why it matters. It matters because we were saying that Jesus of Nazareth was of the same being as God. Jesus who put a towel around his waist and washed the feet of the poor like a slave. Jesus who told us to love our enemies. Jesus who forgave his torturers. Jesus who suffered on a cross as a slave would. That Jesus, that extraordinary person, is of the very same being as God. I wondered whether Constantine ever noticed the irony. He didn't seem that interested in the theology itself, to be fair, though he's given us a nice conference to sort it out. But imagine, Jesus was no emperor, no rich man, but a suffering slave. And this is what the being of God is. That's why I, Joanna, became a Christian, and why Bishop Peter, a former enslaved man, became a Christian, and then Episcopos. We follow one who was in the form of God, and yet lived and died in the position of a slave, who came to redeem us all out of any slavery. That's why it counts what we are saying here. That's why I hope the world will hear what we agreed here and keep hearing it. Jesus was more than a good man. He was of the same being as God. And you know, you can find this all there in the scriptures. Read that letter that Paul once wrote to my church in Philippi. He did not grasp at equality with God. You know that piece, don't you? That's what we were saying at Nicaea, but in borrowed language that the world around us could understand. I wonder if Constantine understood how very subversive it really was, and how eventually it would bring down his empire and reshape the world. We love Jesus and the God we know through him. And that's what we wanted to put into words. you, Joanna. Well, there was a bit more of the story after Nicaea, and the argument about what language to use didn't get fully settled until 451. But the work was done at Nicaea, and its words echo down the centuries. I'm pretty sure that you will sing them every Christmas, several times, even if you wouldn't dream of saying the creed. O come all ye faithful, God of God, light of light, very God, begotten, not created. So we live in a time when it's a struggle to find a way to tell the world who Jesus is for us. I find myself wanting now to honour the struggle they had at Nicaea to find words to speak into a particular culture and language that conveys something of the miracle of God's revelation in Jesus Christ. It wasn't the first struggle of that kind, and it should never be the last, because we need to do it now. Like those Christians in 325, we are a minority faith in a context that is not far sometimes from hating us. How are we going to find the language that we need? I think we can only really celebrate Nicaea not by repeating the words of the Nicene Creed, necessarily, but by doing what they did in 325, but in ways relevant for 2025. The most important thing for me about Nicaea, and also for us, is the question, who do you say I am? What do we believe about Jesus? I think we need really urgently to be speaking about this in our post-Christian culture. Could hardly be more central to what we need to do. At Nicaea, the question was how to speak of Jesus' divinity without being misunderstood, without making him a second god or a demigod. And they settled on language about him being of the same being with God. And I think that the really key thing about Nicaea was that they were saying that the Jesus we see in the Gospels, the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, who had compassion for the poor, who ate with sinners and was never disgusted by any human being, he was of the same being with God. That's the point. If Nicaea can unite us, it need not be all about saying the words of the creed in our worship, but about a unity based on our common experience that in Jesus we really see what God is like, and that God is not distant or mighty and abstract, but made flesh in someone who put himself in the place of the enslaved, the poor, the rejected, and the suffering, the one who lives with the people of Colombia. This is where God is found. It seems to me that that theology is absolutely in line with a culture of small congregations with little power or recognition in the world. We know what it means to be there. Those gathered at Nicaea, in spite of the convening power of an emperor, affirm that the reality of God coming to us embodied among the poor, celebrating that the very same God who made everything in heaven and on earth was made flesh in Jesus Christ. But this is what God is like. A Nicene faith is not then one that cedes to empire, but one that subverts and transforms it. The theological idea that the Palestinian peasant prophet was of the same being as God is still profoundly radical. And that this theological insight emerged in the midst of a messy conference where egos were opposed and compromises forced doesn't make it any less amazing. The World Council of Churches speaks of the Nicene Creed as an ecumenical symbol of the unity of the church in faith. It stands for that moment when the whole Christian world struggled to find a way they could speak in unity about what God has revealed in Jesus. And a real question for us today is, how can we speak of Christ together today into this post-Christian world that we see all around us? We find our voice on social issues readily enough. Often the World Council, Catene, others speak about social issues, about issues of politics and justice. But I wonder whether we shouldn't be trying even harder to speak with one voice about what God has revealed to us in Jesus. That's how I would like us to honour the anniversary of Nicaea in 2025. And so, let's come back to our own context. Let's leave the warmth of Isnic, Nicaea, and come back to the slightly damp Wales. We live in challenging times. They are very different from those who were at Nicaea. The church then had a hugely changed position in culture and society, in the opposite direction from the one we're going in. And they knew they had some structural things to address, those 20 canons. They had their own constitutional debates. But they knew that the church never only needs reform to its structures and rules, even about things like the date of Easter. We also need deep and internal change so that we can speak faithfully, powerfully about what has been revealed in Jesus Christ. The church has now in our times lost without doubt political and social power, and also in many ways now moral and intellectual power. In this space, in this emptiness, every Christian is called to make Christ present. We live in a secular age, but we can learn from the church's long tradition of recontextualizing faith in new times and finding ways to dialogue with those around us. Those at Nicaea were doing this, and this is what the church needs to do again. Times of crisis in institutional religion often bring a revival among the faithful, a renewal of the experience of faith at its deepest. Faith, as someone has put it, must always be more like going to the theatre than reading the score of the opera. It has to be about the experience. And so we need places and people where that experience of faith can be made vivid and deep. This isn't about philosophical arguments, abstractions, but about saying this is what it feels like to be a Christian. The church is now small in our land, as it was once small even in 325. But look what the church did to the Roman Empire. Absolutely transformed it. And God is at work in the world beyond the visible boundaries of our chapels. And we need to trust that too, and to trust God. We must resist any urge to barricade ourselves against an unfriendly world, but rejoice to be salt and leaven within the world. And we must keep on defending and creating good ground for the things that Christianity has made possible in our contemporary world, things that it brought to the world that began with empire and slavery. Things like human rights, social justice, loving family life based on equality and dignity. People have forgotten now that these things came from the heritage we hold and speak of. They need to know. You can find today lots of people expressing a need for authentic spirituality, for those who are faithful, who will engage openly and deeply with the world. We're called now to make Christ, who is incarnate, crucified and risen, present in this world, just as he was in 325. Our challenge is to live faithfully, authentically, with integrity, when Christianity once again is culturally despised. since a witness to the presence of God is all the more needed amongst people filled with longing for meaning and hope. I think what they were doing at Nicaea was relating Christianity to the culture around them, but not succumbing to that culture. In fact, radically subverting it. We need to do something similar. We have to begin by loving Jesus and journeying with him in his kind of relationship with God the Father. A faith that is defined by warm experience, so that our faith doesn't fall back into empty dogmatic definitions. Jesus offers, first of all, an invitation to a journey on which we learn to transform our humanity. We are losing or have lost our institutional power at this moment. But let's not respond to that by defending our institutional interests, by being self-centred and self-focused, but turn instead to the Christ who belongs to all his people and who loves the world. Let's grow up and out of our anxiety and find a wider horizon. So I'm going to end with two stories. The first meeting of the WCC Faith and Order Commission that I chaired, so you have to picture about 60 people plus staff, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, all kinds of Reformed and Protestant. First meeting was in 2015 in an Orthodox monastery in the mountains of Romania. And each day we would go to worship in the chapel with the monastic community. But on Sunday, the people from the local area packed the church, absolutely packed it to the walls. There were parents bringing young babies to the front to be blessed, older people bowed with age and frailty, and young people and children strong in body and voice. The people paid good attention to the liturgy, but they had little to do. No hymns to sing, like in our chapels. But there was one moment when the people spoke all together, and they spoke the words of the creed. And they didn't just speak the creed, mumble it like we've sometimes heard, but they declared it with loud, confident voices. They spoke as one, as though they were about to go on some great, even dangerous adventure. I did not know that a creed could sound like that. This wasn't a dead text with quiet voices, but a clarion call to faith. It took my breath away. That's one story. And then a story from the 1904-5 Welsh revival that I have only just discovered, but you will no doubt know it. It was the 14th February 1904 in a meeting in Newquay, Cardiganshire. At Tabernacle Calvinistic Methodist Church, the service had ended, and the minister, Joseph Jenkins, was holding an after meeting for the young people. I've only just learned what an after meeting is. Jenkins asked the young people, "What does Jesus Christ mean to you?" Someone answered, "He is the hope of the world." Jenkins, being a very wise minister, asked the question again, emphasising "to you." And Florrie Evans, a young girl, replied, "I love Jesus Christ with all my heart." And the whole meeting was moved to tears. So I wonder whether we could imagine that the words they agreed at Nicaea were found by those who love Jesus Christ with all their hearts. And their words may have been later distorted and decayed into abstract doctrines. But there was a time, and I can still feel it, when they did come from the heart and from an authentic struggle and determination to speak the faith for their times. That's what we need to do today, to find wherever we can that sense of deep love and connection with Jesus Christ, that radical prophet who intensified the law, who commanded us to love, who gave his life, who healed and forgave and raised up, who was and is of the same being with God. That's my prayer for 2025. Let's do it. Amen.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Susan. Thank you very much indeed. Part of me says that a response should be silence, I think. Reverend